Gentlemen, shall we settle down and start the next panel? This afternoon, this is our third panel. I'm Lincoln Bloomfield, and I'm pleased to be back for another panel. This one is going to be more dynamic because one of our speakers is going to be exiting, another one is going to be arriving, so it'll be much more exciting than having people sitting in a stationary mode. We're going to talk about the IRGC and sanctions. I am joined, I'm going to start with Bruno Tertrais. He is the Deputy Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche, Stratégique. And then I'm joined by Mr. Eduard Lintner, the former Deputy Minister of Interior of Germany. Be very interested in his comments. Michael Pregent, did I say that correctly?
Yes.
The Middle East Analyst of the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and Ambassador Robert Joseph, U.S. Special Envoy for Nuclear Nonproliferation and former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security until 2007. Bob, it's great to be with you again. So, if you have been following the conversation today, you've heard from senior military officers and from intellectual and editorial observers of Iran and the regime. I want to challenge this panel to ask the basic question, what can sanctions do? How important is the IRGC in terms of the violations of international law and international norms and the aggression that is being visited upon the Middle East? And so, are sanctions the best and most appropriate response? Do they work? But beyond that, the question is, what is the future of these people? Not the important ones, but the foot soldiers, who are the young men with arms, as they say, the men with guns, who in 39 years under a dictatorship, it's a job, it's an easy job, nobody will arrest you if you're in the IRGC, you're safe, and so you engage in all kinds of things, smuggling weapons and cash, explosives, trafficking in persons, if you read the State Department's latest report, trafficking in young men, young women, stealing young men from Afghanistan and taking them to Syria where they can't leave, they have to fight, selling drugs. They've been caught driving 18-wheel vehicles full of heroin in Europe, even while they're executing people for selling small amounts of drugs in southern Iran. So the IRGC is a big enterprise. I'd like to hear from our panel on their thoughts on what can the international community do to object to the behavior of this organization, and maybe what can they do to persuade many of the people who are in the organization that their future lies in making a move away from it. How about that for a provocative question? And to get us started, let me turn to my right and your left, and let's hear from Bruno Tertrais.
Oh, thank you, Lincoln. You asked provocative questions, so I'll try to give you provocative replies about the politics of sanctions. Let me make 3 or 4 points about this. First of all, it's undeniable that sanctions matter, and they've been particularly important to force the regime to accept a negotiation which led to what some call a bad deal, what I would call an imperfect deal, but that's the deal we have. Some would say we had, but it still exists, at least on paper. When you look at how much the regime lost in oil revenue during the high period of sanctions, maybe $150 more billion. When you look at the contraction of the economy, maybe 15–20%, it's undeniable that sanctions did play an important role in forcing this regime to the negotiating table. When you talk about sanctions against Iran, obviously targeting the IRGC matters a lot because it's ultimately today the core of the regime. However, I would say that in any policy regarding the Islamic Republic, sanctions are a necessary but insufficient component.
Sanctions are not a magic bullet. We've noticed, we know, you know, that this regime has been rather resilient, that many Iranian entities have found ways to live with them, to live with sanctions, that the IRGC has adapted, unfortunately, to sanctions. Sanctions are not the only tool that exists to influence the Iranian economy. Variations in oil prices, I would argue, have been as important. The problem is that sometimes sanctions backtrack. We all know that. Those who've been in government know that the fine-tuning of sanctions is an art, not a science. Maybe sanctions have, unfortunately, reinforced the role of the IRGC in some segments of the economy. You all know the importance of the IRGC in the Iranian economy, which is, I said the core, I could say the backbone. They control maybe 20, maybe 30% of the Islamic Republic's economy. They're present in each and every major sector: transport, energy, communication, etc. So sanctions have to be fine-tuned. My hope, and I think it should be everybody's hope, is that the current disagreement, major disagreement between the US administration and most European governments on the fate of the JCPOA will not prevent us from finding agreements on some particular issues related to Iran policy. This is why it's extremely important to lower the political temperature between both sides of the Atlantic now that the Trump administration has made its choices that most European governments, including myself, regret. But that's the situation we're in. But what we don't want is this regime to benefit from a transatlantic crisis over Iran policy and its direct and indirect consequences. How will Europe approach this new phase? I think it's hard to deny that European businesses will be extraordinarily wary of doing business with Tehran. They know that their economic interests lay more with the United States than with the Islamic Republic. But this does not mean that Europe, and the EU in particular, will not be willing and able to take targeted sanctions for specific IRGC behavior regarding the missile program, regarding terrorism, or regarding trafficking, for instance. I don't think there will be a new agreement. The French president has, for tactical political reason, has instructed the French government to work with other European countries on the parameters, the contours of a new agreement. I understand the logic. I'm just saying that there will be no new agreement. It's nevertheless important for us to try to continue, not build, but at least maintain some bridges between the US and Europe on this issue. And this idea of a new agreement, I would submit, is more important for transatlantic relations and for European unity than for the ultimate fate of the Iranian nuclear program. Nevertheless, the French president heralded 9 months ago that he was planning to go to Tehran. Remember that? He will not. I mean, I'm betting on the fact that he will not. I think he has seen the limits of what is possible and not possible to do vis-a-vis this current regime. So the mere fact that this trip has been de facto delayed sine die is implicitly, I think, a good sign in terms of us avoiding too many divergences between Washington and the main European capitals. In the end, I think sanctions, it's commonplace to say they're not a magic bullet. I would just say they're necessary but insufficient. Sanctions will not bring down this regime. The IRGC, of course, will not go down without a fight, and it's important, as you said, Linton, to try to have them evolve against their will, if necessary. But ultimately, change in the Republic of Iran will come probably more from the exasperation of the Iranian people themselves due to the mismanagement of the economy, due to the massive corruption, due to the brutality of the IRGC, than only through sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Lintner, for a long time I've been impressed by the German government's intelligence reports that are in English, that are unclassified, that talk about efforts by the regime of Iran to meddle inside Germany. And the information I introduced about the truck full of heroin was a Deutsche Welle report from last January 2017. So could you share some of your thoughts and experience about how one should respond to the actions of the IRGC and whether your view of sanctions as a lever of influence?
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation, but I have to apologize because I use a translation because my English isn't so perfect that I could talk about that without any help. But of course, owing to its key function in the Iranian system of rule, the Revolutionary Guards poses a problem which Europe cannot avoid to engage. It is by no means a marginal issue. Trade is essential for a country's well-being, but one has to probe a partner offering himself when considering opening or maintaining trade relations with him. Good trade relations are characterized by safety and stability, but precisely these are conditions that the Iranian regime is unable to guarantee, since it is threatened in its existence by the relentless protests that have been going on for months. And just some minutes before, I wrote an article in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a very famous newspaper in Germany. From Wednesday, they are reporting good, I think, and in a good way about the closing of the bazaars and so on. And therefore, that means that the German press and the German public opinion is informed. And I think we can get help by the public opinion for all those ideas you have to make pressure on the regime, for instance, with sanctions. And of course, I have to go back to my paper, and any principal change in Iran is conditioned by dismantling of the Revolutionary Guards. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards commands has an enormous amount of power, and the economic and political and security sections at its disposal, and is therefore the most formidable obstacle on the way to democratic change. In this light, it is obvious that sanctions against the Guards and persons connected with it can be a substantial contribution to approaching democracy in Iran. This should be combined with an effective support of the democratic oppositions. We are going to do that in Germany. Time and again, it is maintained that the sanctions imposed on Iran affect primarily the country's population and should therefore be lifted. That's the opinion which somebody is supporting in Germany. If you look at things more closely, we will find that this statement does not apply to Iran. As a result of the 2015 nuclear deal, sanctions imposed on Iran were largely raised. Suddenly, $140 billion are disposable, and additionally, the oil production was increased from 1.5 million barrels to 2 million barrels a day. The population benefits from none of those means. Riotous corruption and enormous spending by the regime on terror and war abroad did not leave any money to be spent for the people. We have to realize these facts. New sanctions will primarily affect the regime. Crimes cost money. A regime that has less money at its disposal than before cannot commit so many crimes as in the past. Okay, in the view of the key positions the Revolutionary Guards hold in keeping up the representative rule and in fostering terrorism in other countries of the region, it must be regarded as an important success for the Iranian resistance that the US listed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terror organization in October 13, 2017. The Canadian Parliament has recommended its government not to establish diplomatic relations with Iran as long as it is ruled by Khamenei and his terrorist revolutionary guards. This step was clearly a response by the Canadian lawmakers to an unbiased information on conditions in Iran, which the Iranian resistance has been delivering for years. The German government has also shown respect for the resistance by requesting the Iranian government to respect the right to demonstrate in public. And German security authorities continuously warn against the Revolutionary Guards and its terrorist squads force activities. It is essential for European countries to consider that the US and Canadian initiatives as potential examples of the attitudes they should adopt towards the Guards. And I hope we can in Germany do something for that this decision or this opinion comes up within the government and in the public opinion. And then I think that would be a very worthwhile help for the things you want to realize in Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I'm sure your statement will help accomplish that very goal. So thank you for that. Now, Michael, in Washington, the Hudson Institute, I've been to many of your events, follows Iran issues closely. They're very analytical. They're looking at the dynamics of this uprising. Give us your thoughts at this point on how to put leverage on this regime, the value of sanctions, the role of the IRGC. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for having me at this panel. What's different now is that the IRGC Quds Force and Iran, the regime, does not have an advocate like they had in 2009. In 2009 through 2013, the Iranian regime faced the toughest sanctions it ever faced before, yet it was still able to do very destabilizing activities. That's because they had a guarantor. And the guarantor was the administration, those in the administration that were working towards the JCPOA, the Iran deal. There were overtures back and forth between the Supreme Leader and the Obama administration to show us you're serious. The ask was made to the United States first, show us you're serious. So we started releasing IRGC Quds Force operatives in Iraq that we never would have released before because they had American blood on their hands and they had Iraqi blood on their hands. But we started releasing them, and they were the ones that Qasem Soleimani was asking for. Despite the sanctions, the IRGC Quds Force was able to conduct some very destabilizing activities in Iraq, Lebanon, and now fast forward to 2018, we've seen what the regime has been able to do, specifically the IRGC Quds Force in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So these sanctions are different. These protests are different. In 2009, the protesters in Iran did not have Western support. They should have had Western support. They did not. These protests are different. You have the narrative being challenged. The narrative is that if Americans get behind protesters in Iran, it will move the protesters towards the regime. We hear that every day in Washington, D.C. And the counter narrative is actually being played out on the ground. The protesters are asking for American support. The protesters are asking for Western support. And this movement is different because it's not like the 2009 movement where it actually had leaders and it was a political movement. This is organic, this is leaderless, this is across the country because of the economic situation tied directly to the economic opportunities that were squandered and lost by the regime and the IRGC Quds Force as it stepped up its destabilizing activities. These protests, this is where you have women that are being persecuted for taking the veil off. You have political dissidents being imprisoned. You have homosexuals being hanged. You have Kurds being hanged. You have opposition leaders being imprisoned without due process. This is billed for Western support. I wish more Western media would actually cover it because, if we're looking for events to cover in the United States, you can see that we can easily get sidetracked on things that some important, some less important. But these protests are very important. What's different this time with sanctions, again, the sanctions under the Obama administration were meant to bring Iran to the table to negotiate an Iran deal, and then Iran pretty much got everything back in Annex 2 of the JCPOA. Annex 2 of the JCPOA was the giveaway. It made the JCPOA a bad deal, an imperfect one if we want to take that language. It basically reactivated the IRGC Quds Force's operational and logistical terror networks. It delisted banks, it delisted individuals, it delisted shipping lines and actual ships that were responsible for shipping weapons to Lebanese Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis. We've seen a lot of activities. So what's different this time is that the president walked away from the Iran deal because of what the IRGC Quds Force was doing. And if you listen to the protesters are blaming the regime for the Iran deal collapsing, not the United States. They're blaming the regime for adventurism, for violating UN Security Council resolutions. And I argued, when I testified in front of Congress, I said we'd have an Iran deal today if the regime didn't violate existing UN Security Council resolutions with ballistic missiles. We'd have an Iran deal today if the regime didn't use commercial aircraft to move captive Afghans to Syria to prop up Assad, or to move militias from Iraq to Syria on commercial aircraft. We'd have an Iran deal today if the regime didn't continue to support terrorism, to continue to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Kitab Hezbollah, Asab al-Haq, Harakat Nujayba, Kitab Imam Ali, and you can just keep going. The Iran deal collapsed because Annex 2 of the Iran deal was a giveaway to the non-nuclear terror threat that was Iran, the IRGC Quds Force. That is all gone now. Annex 2, we're going to start looking at sanctioning entities like Satad, the Supreme Leader's personal fortune of almost $190 billion. Like you said, sanctions aren't enough. What we should do also is highlight Qasem Soleimani's personal fortune, the Basij commander's personal fortune, the Supreme Leader's personal fortune. I mean, Mohammad Reza Nakhti was the leader of the Basij. He's the one responsible for putting down the 2009 protests. He received sanctions relief. We need to publish these individuals' personal wealth because those soldiers that you talked about, what happens to the foot soldier in the IRGC Quds Force when they find out that their commanders make 1,000 times more than they do, and yet they're carrying out all the risks? There are things we need to do. The good thing that I'm hearing, I think this is a good thing. The private sector is not listening to reassurance from their European governments that they should invest in Iran. The European private sector, it was hesitant to go into Iran when the United States was in the JCPOA, and less hesitant now. They may not be listening to their governments when their governments say, go ahead and do this, but they are listening to U.S. Treasury. They are listening to the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions on Iran, on Russia and China. The United States just announced that they will not offer any waivers on the import of Iranian oil to any country, and are actually using leverage with sanctions against Russia and China to get them to move towards a position on North Korea. And the North Korea thing is important. I'll stop here. The North Korea-Iran deal, Iran warned North Korea that the president would walk away from an Iran deal, and you can't trust the United States. What the regime should actually warn North Korea is to not violate existing UN Security Council resolutions. Do not detain Americans when they go to Iran. Do not detain U.S. Navy sailors. Do not film them as a Geneva Convention violation for propaganda purposes on their knees. Do not continue to launch ballistic missiles. Do not continue to export terrorism, and then you'd likely have a nuclear deal. What I love about the negotiations with North Korea is walking away from the JCPOA actually gave us leverage. You'll listen to Democrats that supported the Iran deal who supported it with the caveat. I understand Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terror, but this is the right way to go. It's either this or war. Those same Democrats now are saying if you negotiate with North Korea, no sunset clause, no benefits before actions, meaning don't front-load sanctions relief, don't give them money before they do things, 24/7 inspections with American inspectors, Canadian inspectors, and include ballistic missiles and include the export of terror. So that's tough language. That's what leverage looks like. So in this current environment, the regime is shedding friends. The Toman has lost 60 to 70% of its value. Those contracts that Russia and China put in place in Iran during the JCPOA, when the U.S. was the guarantor that Iran would not become a nuclear power, are 60% less valuable than they were when they signed these contracts. So Iran is shedding friends. If they rush to a bomb, they lose Europe. If they rush to a bomb, Russia actually has to put its foot down because Russia does not want the Islamic Republic to have a nuclear weapon on their border. And China is simply tired of pouring billions of dollars into Iran's economy to offset the hesitancy of U.S. private sector and European private sector companies. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And as I noted this morning, there was a biannual report from the Secretary General of the UN yesterday repeating that a whole list of violations continue to occur on Resolution 2231. And let me just note that Mr. Jean-Sylvestre Mongrenier has arrived. He's the member of the Institut Thomas More and researcher at the Institut Français de Géopolitique. We will get to him momentarily. But first, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Bob Joseph, who has had authority in the past, I think, over implementing sanctions and removing them. So as a senior policy practitioner, Bob, can you give us your reflections? You've heard panelists, your thoughts on leverage against the IRGC and sanctions, please.
Pleased to do so. And Link, it's good to see you. And let me also thank the organizers for inviting me to participate once again in this annual gathering. It's a great event, and I'm happy to be a very small part of it. I mean, this is an event of tens of thousands of those who are committed to a free and democratic Iran, and my very best to all that attend. In terms of the Annex 2, I would just add one footnote. Annex 2 was one of a number of fatal flaws of the JCPOA, and we could spend the entire session on what those flaws were, including ineffective verification, allowing Iran to pursue advanced centrifuges, failure to cover missiles, failure to deal with the potential military activities that were uncovered by the IAEA. We could go on, but I think that's behind us because on 8 May, President Trump made what I consider to be the correct and very courageous decision to leave the JCPOA. In terms of your question, Link, on sanctions and whether sanctions work, my answer would be sanctions can work. Sanctions can work if they're part of a broader strategy, a strategy that has a diplomatic component, a military component, an intelligence component, and a broader economic component. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I think it's also essential to note that sanctions work best when they're coupled with support of the people, in this case, the Iranian people. The regime has tried to portray sanctions as directed against the Iranian people. But you can see from the protests that have occurred over the past years that the Iranian people simply aren't buying that line. They understand what the cause is, and they appropriately put the blame on the Iranian regime. This is a regime that they know has mismanaged the natural resources of Iran, has spent billions, if not tens of billions, on misadventures in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and to support terrorist proxies. This is a regime that that is corrupt to the core. As Secretary of State Pompeo said recently, the Iranian people can smell the pervasive corruption of this regime and are reacting against it. And I think that is perhaps one of the most essential elements of having sanctions work and having the broader strategy work. So what can we do? Well, I think it's very clear that we can continue to attack the financial networks of the IRGC. Recently, we reimposed sanctions on the governor of Iran's central bank for funneling funds from the IRGC to Hezbollah. And there's many more things that we can do in that context. We can also broaden sanctions to other sectors beyond petroleum-related and financial-related transactions, to mining, to engineering, to construction. The IRGC is pervasive within and across the Iranian economy, and there's much more room to apply truly effective sanctions that can get at their not just power, but their lack of liability in the eyes of the Iranian people. In terms of working with others, I think sanctions will be effective as we move beyond sort of the political impediments that have existed as a consequence of President Trump's decision to leave the JCPOA. Once we're beyond those impediments, I think we will work very closely with our European partners because, let's face it, the European companies are faced with the choice of either continuing to cooperate and work with Iran or to face a complete divorce from the American economy. That's really not much of a choice for the economies, or for the corporate entities in Europe, and you can already see shipping companies, insurance companies, petroleum companies already moving to abandon their relationships with Iran. They have said that they will continue those relationships only if waivers are offered. And Secretary Pompeo has again said that that's very unlikely. It's simply not going to happen. I would just conclude by emphasizing again the importance of working with the Iranian people and working with the opposition outside of Iran, who are determined to achieve that free and democratic Iran. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Thanks, Ambassador. And let me again welcome Jean-Sylvestre Mongrenier. We're finishing this first round with comments about how to exert leverage on the IRGC. What do we want them to do? What can we do? And what is the benefit of sanctions? So welcome, and we look forward to your remarks. Sir.
Oui, merci. I speak French. Sorry for that.
Thank you. I will now speak French.
Oui, bon, je ne suis pas à proprement parler un spécialiste
I'm not
des gardiens de
an
la
expert
Révolution.
about
Il me semble qu'en France comme en
guardians,
Europe, la priorité
the IRGC, but I believe that in Europe, priority must be given to understanding such a policy. We are working towards a summit between President Trump and Putin. There are many worries about this summit in Europe, but I believe that the most worry is about Iran and the Middle East beyond disruptions in Europe. We all agree that the JCPOA was a bad agreement. I think that it doesn't, it's not necessary to discuss it further. The Iranian regime preserved its nuclear facilities, and there is also the question about the after 2025 and the resolution 2231. We know that this was not respected, and the spirit of the accord in general was not complied with by Iran, because we wanted a complete change of the regime with a democratic dimension that was supposed to arise, but this did not occur. We know now that it wasn't so simple to change the regime, but no sign of change at all was seen. And even while the agreement was about to be signed, we know know
des
now
gardiens de la
that one
Révolution
of
et
the
qui était à
general,
Moscou
the
pour préparer une
IRGC
intervention
leader, was in
combinée donc
Moscow
avec la
to
Russie
prepare a combined
pour
action with
soutenir
Russia in
mordicus
order
Bachar
to
al-Assad.
support
Et donc au
Bashar
total, là,
al-Assad.
pour en terminer avec ce premier
So
point,
to
le
conclude on this
Moyen-Orient est
first point,
toujours engagé dans une
the Middle East
dialectique
is still
infernale entre d'un côté
involved
le
in
djihadisme de
evil
fracture chiite et de l'autre
scheme.
côté le djihadisme
On
de
one
fracture
side
sunnite.
there is
Et c'est tout l'enjeu finalement
Sunni jihad and on the
de
other
l'Iran,
side
de la question
the Shia jihad, and
iranienne,
it's
du futur de ce
the question
régime,
at the heart
puisqu'il
of
semble
the
quand même
future of the
difficile
Iranian
de
regime,
faire
because
accepter
it
à 300
seems
millions
difficult
d'Arabes
to
sunnites de passer sous le contrôle de l'Iran et en
get
quelque
the,
sorte de prétendre déléguer à
population
Téhéran la lutte contre
to,
le djihadisme. Nous sommes engagés en fait sur deux
fight
fronts
jihad.
géopolitiques.
We are
C'est vrai que ça
here
n'est
on
jamais aisé de se
two
battre sur
political
deux fronts
fronts
géopolitiques. Cela
difficult.
dit, ce n'est pas
It's
la
difficult to
Troisième Guerre mondiale.
fight
On n'est pas face
two
aux mêmes
fronts at the
apories
same
qu'en
time. It's not the Third World War.
1940-41.
It's different
Et
from
donc, c'est quelque
the
chose qui est à la
40s
mesure des
and
stratégies occidentales.
it's
Alors, dans un deuxième temps, je reviens
complete
sur la
different
méthode
strategy.
européenne, celle qui a été mise en avant
Now
par
about
Paris, par
the European
Londres et par
method
Berlin, et
that
dont
was
notre président
put
Emmanuel
forward
Macron c'était
by
particulièrement le héros.
England, France
L'idée,
and Germany.
c'était qu'il
The
fallait
idea
maintenir
was
l'accord
to maintain
existant,
the
s'appuyer sur ce qui
existing
existe en quelque
agreement
sorte, et
and
puis à
base
partir de
everything
là,
on
essayer
what had
d'élargir,
been
d'ajouter 2
signed
voire
and then
3 piliers.
extend it with
Une
2 or 3
négociation
more
sur
pillars.
l'avenir
So
du
a
Moyen-Orient, qui
negotiation
consisterait
about
en
the
une sorte
future of the
d'endiguement
Middle
soft
East.
du régime dans la région, et puis
slow,
la question du programme balistique.
Rise
avec
of
en
the
outre,
regime
donc,
in the region,
une
and
négociation
then
sur
there was a
l'après
negotiation
2025. C'est pour ça que
about
j'ai
the
dit
after
entre 2 ou 3 piliers
2025. So
supplémentaires.
that's why I said
Alors, on
2 or
parle de
3 more
méthode,
pillars.
mais en fait de méthode, il
We
faudrait
spoke
revenir à
about
l'étymologie. C'est un
method,
terme
but
grec,
the
méta, c'est
term
après,
method
c'est
comes
le
from
méta
the
de
Greek,
métapolitique, et puis odos,
meta,
c'est le chemin,
and
donc ça
odos,
suppose
the
un
path,
véritable
and this
objectif, une
suggests that
stratégie
there should be
bien
a true
affirmée, et puis
objective and a
qu'on se mette
strategy
en
and a
marche,
way
sans mauvais jeu de
to
mots.
go, and then
Or, finalement, ça a été une simple
marching toward
esquisse,
this objective.
c'était une rhétorique
But this
qu'autre
was
chose,
more
non pas par mauvaise
rhetorical
volonté de la part de Paris, de Londres et de
game
Berlin,
than
mais tout simplement parce
from
que
Berlin
d'emblée,
and Paris,
les responsables et
because from the very
dirigeants du
beginning,
régime iranien
the various
ont affirmé
Iranian
leur
leaders
refus. Emmanuel
asserted
Macron
their
s'est fait
denial
rembarrer
of this.
pour parler de
President
manière
Macron
commune, vulgaire. Et
was
lorsque Jean-Yves Le
pushed
Drian, notre
away,
ministre des Affaires
and when
étrangères, s'est
Mr. Le
rendu en
Drian, the
mars
foreign
donc,
affairs
en Iran
minister,
pour essayer
went to
d'amorcer une
Iran in
négociation de ce
March
type, il
in
a été
order
accueilli dans une
to
ambiance particulièrement
start
hostile.
negotiations.
Donc au
He
final,
found a very
les capitales
hostile
européennes, celles qui composent ce que l'on appelle l'UE3, qui était la
what
cheville
we call
ouvrière de la
the
négociation de cet
EU3,
accord, se sont retrouvés au
the
pied du mur,
negotiating parts of
soit
these agreements
finalement
are
on
now
mettait sous un
facing
mouchoir les reproches qui étaient adressés
issues.
à
Either
Téhéran
we
en matière
ignore
de prolifération
the
balistique,
fact that
en
Iran
matière de
did not
déstabilisation du
comply
Moyen-Orient,
with
et puis on en revenait
what
purement et
was
simplement
agreed
à
on,
justifier
and
un
coming
statu
back
quo qui
to
n'existe pas
justifying a
sur le
status
terrain,
quo that
soit la phase
concretely
suivante, c'était la
doesn't
mise en place de
exist,
sanctions,
or
alors peut-être pas au
implementing
titre du
sanctions,
non-respect de l'accord de
maybe
juillet 2015,
not
puisque grosso
in the
modo,
name of
on estime qu'il
complying
est
with
à peu
the
près respecté,
agreement,
mais que le véritable problème,
because
c'est que
as
cet
said
accord
previously,
n'est
we
pas
consider
complet,
that
c'est
it's
que c'est un
somehow
mauvais accord,
complied
mais en
with,
tout cas,
but
des sanctions
although
au
it's
titre
bad,
du programme
but
balistique,
implementing
d'une
some
part, et puis d'autre
sanctions
part,
about
de la
the
déstabilisation du
ballistic
Moyen-Orient.
program and
Alors, en fait,
destabilization
le président
of
américain, Donald
the,
Trump, en
Middle
dénonçant
East
cet accord,
countries.
le 8 mai dernier, nous a fait
President
en quelque
Trump,
sorte prendre un raccourci, puisque
took
le
a
fait est que la situation est complètement bouleversée.
withdrawing from this
Alors, dans cette
agreement,
affaire,
and
ce qui me
now,
semble
the
important, c'est de
situation
maintenir
is,
à l'unité
completely,
du camp occidental,
reversed.
même si au regard de
And
certaines déclarations, on a le
now, in
sentiment
the light of
parfois
some
que ça devient un simple
declarations,
effet de voix,
we
flatus
think
vocis. Alors
that
maintenir
is
l'unité
just,
du front occidental, non pas simplement par goût du
maintaining
consensus,
the
même si le
Western
consensus a sa
front,
valeur, c'est important,
united,
mais parce qu'il y a de véritables intérêts de
because
sécurité
there
qui sont
are
en
true
jeu dans cette
security
affaire, que
interests
ce soit la
at
menace
stakes
directe
here,
représentée par ce
be it
régime
the
et
direct
son
threat from
intention
this
stratégique,
regime and
ou
its
alors d'une manière plus
strategical
générale les menaces
intention,
indirectes
but
qui
also
découlent de toute la
indirect threats
déstabilisation
that
du Moyen-Orient,
come
du fait de
from
la politique
destabilization
iranienne.
of
Alors,
the Middle
le
East
fait est
in
que les
general.
intérêts de sécurité
So,
sont beaucoup plus importants
security
que des
interests
questions
are
de
clearly
marché,
more important than
des questions finalement
commercial
pas commerciales, là, sur
interests.
lesquelles très vite, malheureusement, le débat en France et en Europe, en
the
tout cas,
debate in
a
France
roulé.
and
Donc,
Europe
il doit y avoir des
quickly
sanctions, il faut
went
parvenir à
over
des
this.
sanctions
So
qui,
there
à minima,
should be
concernent le programme
sanctions,
balistique, comme
at
je l'ai dit,
least about the
concernent toute la
ballistic
politique de
program,
déstabilisation
and
du
also
Moyen-Orient. Et le point
the
commun, finalement, à toutes ces
destabilization
questions, que ce soit le
action
programme
in
balistique,
the
le programme
region,
nucléaire dans ses
but
virtualités et la
whether
déstabilisation
it's
du
about the
Moyen-Orient, ce
ballistic
sont les
or
gardiens de
nuclear
la
program,
révolution. C'est l'épine
they're all
dorsale, c'est la
led
colonne
by
vertébrale
the
du régime.
IRGC.
Et donc,
This
de
is
fait,
the
il faut viser
skeleton
cette
of
colonne
the regime,
vertébrale.
and we shall
Ça
aim
pose
at them.
ipso facto la question du régime, du changement de régime. On sait que dans les pays occidentaux, on est devenu très réservé quant au scénario de changement de régime, parce que le fait est que la période chaotique qui suit, elle est quand même assez difficile à clôturer. Il suffit de penser à la question irakienne. Il n'en reste pas moins qu'en dernière analyse, contrairement à ce que peuvent penser des tenants d'une réelle politique doctrinaire, on ne peut pas purement et simplement dissocier la question du régime, d'une part, et puis la question de la politique étrangère, d'autre part. Alors, je constate que bien souvent, ceux qui viennent sur la pointe des pieds sur le terrain du changement de régime expliquent qu'il faudrait maintenir le statu quo en espérant qu'ultérieurement une sorte de Gorbatchev iranien surgisse. Ce qu'on peut leur rappeler, c'est que Gorbatchev, finalement, n'a pas été le rénovateur du socialisme, comme il espérait. Il en aura été le fossoyeur. Le fait est que ça s'est terminé par un changement de régime, par l'effondrement même purement et simplement de l'URSS. Alors, en guise de conclusion, je dirais que ce qui manque à ce semblant de stratégie qui semble s'esquisser du côté américain, c'est une véritable vision. À mon sens, il ne peut pas y avoir de grande stratégie sans une vision d'ensemble, une vision haute, une haute politique qui dépasse le simple chacun pour soi. Or, il se trouve qu'on manque quand même beaucoup de visibilité sur la politique américaine au Moyen-Orient. En ce jour précis, je pense au groupe rebelle qui se trouve dans le sud de la Syrie, du côté de l'Iran, qui ont le sentiment d'être purement et simplement abandonnés. On éprouve aussi pas mal d'inquiétudes sur le futur de la présence américaine dans le nord-est de la Syrie. D'une manière générale, il me semble quand même particulièrement difficile de prétendre mener d'un côté une politique d'endiguement, voire de refoulement de l'Iran au Moyen-Orient, et simultanément de mener une politique de désengagement du Moyen-Orient. Et à mon sens, ça n'est pas un grand marché, un deal, comme on dit aujourd'hui, avec Poutine qui permettrait de résoudre cette contradiction. Poutine qui, en quelque sorte, viendrait donc endiguer pour notre plus grand bien à tous, à l'Iran, au Moyen-Orient. Je vous remercie.
As a force against Iran in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much.